Okay, so on our handout last time we looked at this handout called New Imperialism, and we got down to the very bottom, and it's called New Imperialism because this is what's happening in the 1800s. And if this is something called New Imperialism, there is something called Old Imperialism, and that's when like the Spanish took over Mexico. That's when the British had 13 colonies. That's when the French had Canada. But there's two parts of the world that white people didn't have any success taking over, and that had been Africa and Asia. But now in the 1800s, they're looking to take over Africa and Asia. We mentioned this last time. I believe we're on the very bottom of the first page where it says Spain, and we're going to write down Spain was part of the first wave of imperialism during the 1500s. So Spain is part of old imperialism. Spain's like that first wave. Spain's that first country that went into America, and because of the Columbian Exchange, they ended up decimating Native American populations with diseases like smallpox. And as a result, Spain on the next line did not play a large role in the 19th century. We call this new imperialism. Spain did not play a large role in new imperialism. Their time to shine was like in the 15 and the 1600s. They do not have a major role in new imperialism. And it's not just European countries that are like beating up and conquering. In fact, Japan, because Japan modernized, you might remember they went through something called the Meiji Restoration. They actually fought a war called the Sino-Japanese War. And in that conflict, who did the Japanese defeat in that conflict? Yeah, exactly right. They defeated China. And the thing about that conflict was that they kind of like learned the lessons of, were you absent on Thursday? The last? Okay, cool. So you have a handout already, and this is going to go with it, and you'll staple this to that handout. So they kind of like learned the lessons of industrialization. The Japanese did, and the Japanese actually do like really good in this time. They fight China and they win, which is like crazy and disheartening for the Chinese, because the Chinese have always looked at Japan as like their little brother. And what happens when your little brother beats you up? Well, that's what happened in the Sino-Japanese War. But on the next line, they also gain control of their neighbor. There's a country just west of Japan. Japan invades and takes them over. What country's just west of Japan? Don't say Vietnam, which has been the answer I've gotten all day. It was like 1,000 miles away from Japan. What's directly west of Korea? Yeah, right down Korea. They gained control of Korea. So Japan learned all the lessons of empire. They began doing what white Europeans were doing. White Europeans were getting colonies, and Japan said, after the Meiji Restoration, sign me up for some of that. Well, let's look at the backside. What is the mindset of white Europeans? Like, what makes them think it's okay to go to like India, go to China, go to Vietnam, go to Algeria? Why is it okay? Well, it says on the handout that Europeans saw themselves as protectors and not invaders. White Europeans were like, hey, we're not actually invading, we're actually liberating, we're helping. We're not invaders, they argued on the handout. They were protectors and they were not invaders on the very top. And this is actually almost exactly what Vladimir Putin says, like to this day. You know, like the war in Ukraine, it's still a thing. Thousands have died. It's like pretty terrible. But Vladimir Putin say, he would argue, I'm not invading Ukraine, I'm liberating them, because he believes that there's Nazis secretly running Ukraine and that he's just only freeing them. And that's how white Europeans kind of view. They thought we're actually helping these brown and black people around the world. And they said at this time, white Europeans felt they were racially superior. They thought that they were actually better than the brown and black people they were coming in contact with. And they weren't saying this is like shady racist stuff at Thanksgiving meals. They were claiming that science backed up the idea that non-whites were inferior. There's a funny word you don't hear very much, but this word is called a phrenologist. And a phrenologist is someone who studies the size and shape of the human skull. In this photograph, you have a phrenologist measuring the size of this guy's skull, and they believe that by the measurements of like how wide your head is and all these different measurements, it could determine how intelligent you are. And they claimed that the head of white people was actually indicative of a larger brain size than that of brown people and a larger brain size of black people. Later, Nazis agreed with this philosophy, and here's a picture of Nazi scientists measuring the width of a nose, and they believed that certain measurements showed that you were part of the master race, the Aryan race. And they believed that your body reflected the truth of biological inferiority or superiority. And here, these Nazi scientists are jotting this information down, believing that the width of your nose or the size of your head would kind of like put you on a pyramid of power. It says on the handout, they believe the shape and size of European skulls demonstrated that they were smarter. And they were saying, hey, this isn't me being a racist. This is just science. And if you were to ask, well, where are you getting this from? Where are you getting, what scientist believes in this? Below the drawings, it tells you the scientist. There was a guy named Charles Darwin. You should know him from ninth grade because you studied biology in ninth grade. And he argued for something you'll write down called survival of the fittest. And these people said, yes, totally agree with Charles Darwin, sign me up for survival of the fittest. And they decided to apply his theory to like the origin of races, like, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indian, whites, black people. And they said, I think you can see evolution with white people being the most evolved and black people being the least evolved. And this is like full on racist. And you might remember that this story comes from a book that Charles Darwin wrote. This is one of the most important books ever written. It's right up there with the Bible, right up there with the Quran, right up there with Communist Manifesto. What book did Charles Darwin write? I've not gotten a right answer today at all. Does anyone know the book he wrote? It's like one of the most famous books of all time, a must-read book. It's the book that explains his theory. Does anyone? Man, I'm so surprised. Like, this is the first year I've never had someone identify this book. I don't know. And ninth grade wasn't your pandemic year. I don't know why. Ortiz, nothing? Man, this is like the first year I've never had someone identify this book. That's crazy to me. Anyway, it's one of the most important books ever written. It's called, you write it down on the blank where it says the book is called On the Origin of Species. That's what it's called. It's called On the Origin of Species. And it's one of the most important books ever written because before this book, people would have said, well, I know where the origin of species comes from. Where did people say all species came from before evolution? Before evolution, what was the answer where all zebra and humans and giraffes came from? What would have been the answer? God. Yeah, God. Like, there's this Bible story, not just the Bible, but the Quran as well. There's these creation stories that says God made all the animals and he made an Adam and he made an Adam's wife and all humans and all animals were made. Well, it turns out that's not true in Charles Darwin's theory. He said that there was a warm puddle of water, got hit by lightning, and they made the first amino acids. Millions of years later, amino acids became the first fish. Millions of years later, fish became an amphibian. Millions of years later, the amphibian became a small mammal. Millions of years later, that became a larger rat. Millions of years later, that became a small ape-like creature. Millions of years later, it became you and me. That's the origin of species, right? This is like the real quick, simplified mutations and random chance gives us who we are. And it says that it argued that the fittest species were the ones who would survive. Like if you are not a fit species, your species will go extinct. The dinosaurs went extinct. The woolly mammoth went extinct. The dodo bird went extinct. That's just like how evolution works. It weeds out the weak. And they began to apply this to human ethnic groups. And it says some took his biological theory and applied it to human ethnic groups. And they decided, I think we can rate humans based on evolution. And they put white people on top. And like, okay, well, who's almost like white people? The Chinese are kind of fair-skinned, and they're like really smart. So put the Chinese in. Are there any brown people that are really smart? Yeah, man, the Indians, super smart. They came up with algebra and advanced mathematics. We'll put the Indians in there. And there's like brown people that are not so great, like the Native Americans. And then sadly, they put black Africans on the very bottom. And they would say, hey, this is just evolution. This is just what Charles Darwin said. This is called social Darwinism. And they said there's evidence for social Darwinism because they said, if you look at the map on the screen, the majority of the world is red or orange. That's majority world conquered by white people. How could we not be superior, they argued, if we are literally controlling almost the entire planet? It says on the handout, the spread of U.S. and European power demonstrated the superiority of whites was the argument that they made. The superiority of whites. And as a result, colonizers introduced their languages so that to this day, what's the most widely spoken language in the world right now? English. Spanish is there as well. Portuguese is there as well. More people speak Portuguese in Africa than they live in Portugal. That Portuguese is not a very convenient language unless you want to go to Mozambique or Angola because they speak it there. French, more people speak French in the Democratic Republic of Congo than live in France. Super helpful if you speak French and you want to have any time in Africa. This last summer, I actually had to go to an emergency room in Burundi. I was there with an older friend. He's in his 70s. My friend Krishna has um, diabetes, and he had like his blood sugar crashed, and he like turned pale, and we had to take Krishna to the hospital. But they only spoke French there, and I have zero French skills and didn't speak any English. And it was like my friend Krishna almost died in the hospital, and it was like terrible, and it was scary, and there was a language barrier because they speak French there because they've spoken French in Burundi for 100 years since the French or the Belgians colonized Central and East Central Africa. So their language is still a huge part to this day. It says below that, colonizers, I think we already got that, they brought their language, which is one of the lasting impacts of empire. Okay, on our new handout that we just got today, it says on the top, religious motives. So why are they doing this? Like, what are the reasons for conquering the world? Well, one of the reasons they're going to say is because of Jesus. And it says missionaries wanted native people to give up their traditional religion. For example, there's something we've talked about before, animism. What is animism? Before we go further, what do you worship in animism? Not animals necessarily. Do you remember watching the Disney cartoon Pocahontas? Who she talked to all the time in Pocahontas?
Oh, spirits. Or a tree.
There's a tree, right? So in animism, you often worship nature, and that's going to be like a tree. Or even if you see, there's a James Cameron movie called Avatar, where there's like these blue creatures in space. You know the movie I'm talking about? In that movie, they also like worship a tree as well. So animism is like Pocahontas, where you worship a mountain, you worship a tree, you worship a hill, you worship a river. That's animism. And white Europeans, when they get to Africa and Asia, they're like, hey, you shouldn't worship trees anymore. That's not okay. And there's a second thing they want to stop, and that's what we're going to write down on this line where it says animism. And especially in Asian cultures, who do you pray to advice for? Who do you pray for wisdom? Who do you like make sacrifices to make sure they're cool with you?
Ancestors.
Yeah, we're going to write down ancestor worship. They want to bring an end to these things. Confucianism has ancestor worship. Shinto, which is like the religion of Japan, has ancestor worship, and white European Christians think this is all a no-no. So it says on the next line that missionaries set up Western-style education in what's called mission schools. So white people would go to Asia, white people would go to Vietnam, white people would go to Africa and India, and they'd set up mission schools. And a lot of people would want to send their kid to a mission school because if you're in Vietnam, what language are you going to learn in a mission school in Vietnam? What white European language are they going to teach you? You're going to teach French. And like, listen, I'm pretty sure my kid's going to have a better chance of getting a job if they speak French, if they're bilingual, right? And so you have white schools set up in India, in Vietnam, in Africa. These are called mission schools. And missionaries introduced this Western-style education. Now, missionaries not just want to educate these brown and black people, but they also wanted to end three things. So there's three things that missionaries wanted to end when they got to Africa and they got to Asia. These are three things they think are not right, they're not okay. The first thing they thought was not right, not okay, was plural marriage. They thought plural marriage was not okay, not right. This is where you have more than one wife, right? And to give you an example of like how they were against it, we've actually talked about this before. What was an American religion that had plural marriage? And they so persecuted this religion, they had to move to Utah for safety. Mormonism. You might remember there was a guy named Joseph Smith Jr. He said that he was a prophet from God. And one of the things God told him is to get to the highest heaven, you have to have more than one wife. So Joseph Smith Jr. had over 20 wives. His youngest wife was 14 years old. He also married sisters who were like sisters. He also, half of his wives were already married to other men. And for all of them, he said, hey, you know what? I don't want to do this, but God told me I need to go marry the 14-year-old. And these people at this time kept a lot of diaries. We know the 14-year-old girl told her dad, I don't want to be with this man. And you can imagine like having sex with a man who's like over twice your age. That would be terrible. This guy's like your pastor. But Joseph Smith actually pulled her aside and said, hey, this is the only way you can know that your parents are going to go to heaven. And so imagine that social pressure. And so she married Joseph Smith. And not only she did, but like over 24 women, including teenage girls, did. This was too much for people at the time. And so Joseph Smith was actually killed by a mob. And after Joseph Smith died, they said, we want to keep doing this plural marriage. And they moved the show to Utah, where they thought they would be free to practice their religion. But what other religion allows polygamy? In fact, their holy book guarantees every man 4 of these as long as he's willing to take care of them equally. What major religion allows polygamy? Islam does. So white Christians show up to Africa. They don't like Islam. They think Islam is a rival, and they want to end polygamy or plural marriage. The second thing they want to end, you write down, is slavery. Slavery, there's a change of heart that white people have. We mentioned that they want to bring an end to like the slave trade, but they also want to like stop it in Africa because slavery was practiced there. But some Africans were against it because what were African elites getting from the slave trade that was beneficial to them? They're getting guns, they're getting gold, they're getting, wealth. So some of the people most against the end of slavery were elite coastal Africans because they were kidnapping inland Africans and marching them 3 to 6 weeks to the coast. So a lot of people who were most against it were Black Africans who benefited. And the third thing that they wanted to bring into an end, we'll write down, is human sacrifice. We've talked about human sacrifice before. What types of people practice human sacrifice that white people were abhorred by? Aztec, right? But it wasn't just the Aztec. People practice human sacrifice in Fiji, which is in the Pacific. People practice human sacrifice in Africa. In fact, in Africa, there's like 3 things that made you likely to be sacrificed. One is if you were an identical twin. Like they were really weirded out by identical twins. They're like, why would there be like 2 of the same one? And often if you were a twin, one of the 2 of you would be killed. So we might have to like get rid of Alyssa, we might need to like, get one of the twins eliminated because they were considered like, one of them was thought to be like evil. A second group of people that were often sacrificed were people who suffered from albinism. What is it called if you have albinism? You're an albino, which means that it's a genetic defect. And so you have like white hair, white eyelashes, your skin is super fair and you burn like super easy. Well, they have albinism in Africa, and that's even more unusual because like everyone's Black and you're like the only white person. So sadly, people who suffer from albinism were often sacrificed. But there's a third group of people that are sacrificed actually even to this day in 2022. This group of people are not often, but they are sacrificed. There's a tribe in Central East Africa called the Pygmies, and they are the shortest African tribe there is. Like full-grown adults are like this tall. And because they're so short and small, people think, oh, there's something like magical about them. And so like if you are having a hard time, like your wife can't get pregnant or you're having financial difficulties, some people will say what you need to do is kill a pygmy, and the power of a pygmy's flesh or blood will help you get what you want. And so these people are still to this day, like right now in 2022, people enslave pygmies, like Black Africans enslave these Black Africans. And these pygmies are sometimes even offered as sacrifice. This last summer actually was in a pygmy village in Burundi, and I got to meet some of the leaders, and they explained some of the challenges of being like the most hated ethnic group in Africa to this day. I'll show you a picture next time. I'll have to look through. But those are things white Europeans showed up like, hey, we need to put an end to these things. They thought they were wrong. But it's not all about Jesus. It's all about the money. And there's economic motives as well. I mean, I can go tell people about Jesus, but no reason not to make profit while I'm doing it. So it reminds us multiple factors entice Europeans to increase their expansion. So it's not just Jesus, multiple factors entice Europeans to increase their expansion. And you might remember that European economies had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had happened and Europe would never be the same again. And you know what? We used to buy shirts from India. We used to buy, cloth from India, but with a machine, I can make cloth and textiles way faster than a hardworking Indian man or woman can. So I don't need India anymore for finished clothing, but what can I not grow in Europe because it's just too cold? What do I need to grow to make clothing? Cotton, and it's just too cold in Europe. So I still need India, but I don't want them to make it anymore. I just want the raw stuff. And we're going to write down European economies needed new sources for raw materials. All the stuff I want, cotton and sugar, all that I can't grow in Europe. Europe's too cold, but I need the raw stuff. Yeah, take the pass, which is right there. There's a blue pass. And if you leave the door open, that way you can come back in. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And also, once I make that raw stuff into finished products, it says European economies also needed new markets for their finished goods. Because now that I've run all the raw materials through a machine, man, I've got more than I need for white Europeans. I want to sell my finished goods to people in South America. I want to sell my finished goods to people living in Asia. I want to sell my finished goods to people in Africa. And at this time, there's two companies that become like the most powerful corporations on the face of the planet, like super, super powerful. And the first one is called the British East India Company. And they were so powerful, this trading company allowed them to control an entire country. Like this corporation was so powerful, they took over a country. What Asian country did the British East India Company take over? They took over India, right? And that was like a big deal that a corporation had enough money and power to take over a subcontinent. Right now, people are like talking about Elon Musk because Elon Musk has been trying to take over what? Twitter. And you might remember last Monday, he spent $2 billion to buy 9% of it. And that's like a lot of money. But I don't know if you saw that recently, he offered a full $43 billion to buy Twitter, like outright. And there's a lot of different responses to that. I put some of these responses to this news on this slide as Elon Musk is the world's the wealthiest man. The first comment I thought was interesting is from David Levitt. He's a journalist. He works for CBS News. Actually, David Levitt is an award-winning journalist. And a journalist, it's their job at CBS to like analyze things analytically, like kind of give like a responsible analysis of like the news. And David Levitt of CBS News posted this. He tweeted this. He says, if Elon Musk successfully purchases Twitter, it could result in World War III and the destruction of our planet. Like that's what this award-winning CBS journalist said, that yes, if he buys it, World War III, destruction of the planet. Jeff Jarvis, he teaches journalism at City University, New York. This is one of our finest journalist programs in the country. So Jeff Jarvis, he's a journalist himself and also a professor of journalism. His job is to train reporters for the next generation. And he said, today on Twitter feels like the last evening in a Berlin nightclub at the twilight of Weimar, Germany. If you don't know the reference, Weimar, Germany was the government of Germany before who took over?
Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler. So this leading professor of journalism says, for Elon Musk to take over Twitter is akin to Adolf Hitler taking over Nazi Germany. Max Boot, who writes for the New York Times, says, I'm frightened by the impact on society and politics if Musk acquires Twitter. He seems to believe that on social media, anything goes. For democracy to survive, we need more content moderation, not less. You might know that Elon Musk is broadly what we call a libertarian. He doesn't believe that you should censor stories on Twitter or you shouldn't be able to like tweet things out that might be offensive. And so Max Boot says we actually need more content moderation, not less. And finally, Axios, which is a leading news site, says the world's richest man, someone who used to be compared to Iron Man, is increasingly behaving like a supervillain, commanding unlimited resources in which to finance his mischief making. And so Elon Musk is actually more like a supervillain, and this is actually super bad. This is much of the response to Elon Musk's attempt to buy $43 billion offer. And Twitter, the board of Twitter does not want to be bought, and they have to figure out how to like resist what's considered, what some people would say, a hostile takeover. Because Musk has argued if he takes over Twitter, he's going to get rid of these bans and these limitations, what people can share. So back in the 1800s, people were worried about the power of the British East India Company. In our world, people are worried about Elon Musk leading to World War III and David Levitt says the destruction of our planet. And these, again, are from like very well-respected journalists today. Below that, another company that was super powerful is the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And they don't, I'm sorry, did I skip one? I skipped one. What made the British East India Company ridiculously wealthy? Well, in the 19th century, they grew wealthy selling China vast amounts of this product that, man, the Chinese were hooked on it. What did they sell China? They sold opium, right? So the British East India Company made a ridiculous amount of money pushing drugs, particularly opium, which resulted in the Opium Wars, which resulted in China being humiliated, which resulted in China kind of being, divided up among all of Europe and Japan. The Dutch also have their hands in Asia. There are companies called the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. They're more traditional. They dominate in spices. That's like one of the things that first attracted white Europeans to Asia, and that's where they make most of their money. But the VOC, not to be outdone, also takes over an entire country. They would take over control of modern-day Indonesia. If you don't know, that's Indonesia. We'll talk more about them, but that's another full-on country. The largest Muslim country in the world, actually, by population, is Indonesia. So, man, white Europeans taking over huge countries was a regular feature. Summary, and then we're going to get a new handout on Africa. In the 19th century, several factors helped the British become the world's leading economic power. The British were the #1 economic power in the world at this time. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason was the British economy was transformed. It actually took the lead in the Industrial Revolution. They were the first place on the planet to have the Industrial Revolution. It's where it began. It's where it started. And if you have a head start, you're going to win. And the British definitely had a head start. It's where the Industrial Revolution started. And not only in industry, but in military affairs, there was something called the Napoleonic Wars. And actually, Britain won a series of wars there. And if I'm fighting the Napoleonic Wars, what country are they fighting? France. We'll write down they won a series of wars with France. Not even having one of the world's greatest generals was enough to keep the British from winning. In the Napoleonic Wars, Britain won a series of wars with France, resulting in Napoleon going to that random island in the Atlantic Ocean. Below that, the British also had a vast and growing empire that provided raw materials. And that's what I want. Man, I need coal, I need cotton, I need raw materials to be sent back to Great Britain because we've got factories that can run 24 hours a day with steam power if we can only get stuff there. And we also have new British colonies that had large amounts of white settlers. And that's important because the 13 colonies are gone. That's important because Canada can only sustain so many people, plus it's cold. But we're going to see that there's going to be 3 countries that white settlers flood from Great Britain by the millions. And as a result, English is still spoken in these countries to this day. And these settler colonies, it says on your handout, provided markets for British finished goods. Because if I'm a white person, I move around the world, I want those same things I used to have back in England. I'm going to order it. Even if it's 2,000, 5,000 miles away, I'm going to order those finished goods. And I bet we could identify these 3 white these white countries. 2 of them are white majorities. One has not a white majority, but a significant white population. What are 3 new countries colonized by the British that have no white people, but today have a majority white people today in 2022? What's that? I can't hear what you're saying. Oh, yeah. So Australia is one of them. So Australia is a white majority nation in 2022. What were the names of the people that were there originally? Aborigines. And because of disease and because of military conquest, the brown-skinned people of Australia were forced off their land. We've seen this story before. New Zealand is the second example. We're going to write down New Zealand. New Zealand is right by Australia. I had people who didn't know where New Zealand was, but I say right by, but it's like 1,000 miles away. Like it's like deceptive. It's close to Australia. New Zealand, if you don't know, that's like where Lord of the Rings franchise was filmed. So it's like widely considered very beautiful, but there's more sheep that live in New Zealand than people. It's not very well populated in New Zealand, but it's widely considered very beautiful. They also have native people. Do you all know the native people of New Zealand? The Maori, and they're actually broadly related to the Polynesian people uh, of like when you see like the Moana story, like the seafarers, those are Polynesians, and they settled New Zealand as well. And the same thing happened there, Salem. They were forced off their land. There's actually more Maori today than there are Aborigines, and Maori culture has actually had a huge impact on modern white New Zealander culture. We'll watch some videos about that probably tomorrow. That's like a great name. Senior? Yeah, that's a great name. Below that, oh, I'm sorry. And one more, there's a third country that millions of white people go to. They never become the majority, but they make sure that only white people would be presidents of this country until the 1990s. What country has a lot of white people? And actually, on this continent, this is the majority, the one place that you'll see white people in large numbers. Yeah, we'll write down South Africa. I don't know if you know, but the first president of South Africa was a guy named Nelson Mandela. I had one class today who'd never heard of Nelson Mandela, and they didn't know who he was. But it turns out South Africa, which is on the southern tip of Africa, and they never had a white majority, but they had, I think, maybe like 15% white at the height. And that's like a lot. If you go to any other country, white people are like the rare, like whenever you see a white person in Africa, like it sticks out, like it's like shocking because like you don't see white people at all. They're like, it's like maybe one white person a day you'll see. And it's like really weird to see a white person. But South Africa, it's like 10-15% of the population. Millions of people move there, and they make sure that only their leaders are presidents. And we don't have a black South African president until Nelson Mandela, who was actually imprisoned for the audacity of wanting black people to have a meaningful role in democracy. So those are three places that white settlers moved to by the millions: New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. Other nations, it says, wanted to challenge Britain's lead, and that's what's going to lead us to our new handout we're going to get in just a minute. It says these nations knew they would have to turn to unconquered parts of the world. And those two unconquered parts of the world we're going to see is Africa and Asia. I'm going to give you a new handout called the Scramble for Africa. We're finally in the 20th century, which is great. Staple these two together so we don't get them mixed up, these 3 pages together. Staple them so they don't get mixed up later. There are 2 staplers around. You drooled on your handout, Jalen Fisher. You were even awake. You just drooled on the handout I gave you. So good. So staple these 3 together. Here you go, buddy. You can make it. We can all make it to May 12th. We just have to make it to May 12th, and we're done. Did I give? Oh, that's all one. That's all one thing. You have 3 pages. We just have to make it to May 12th, and we're done. And we're in the 20th century, so that's good. Here you go. Here you go. There you go, Salem. Here you go. Sorry for making you last, but you're not least. Okay, so we obviously can't finish, but we can get a lot done, or a significant amount of stuff done. Let's talk about the Scramble for Africa. So imperialism in Africa, it says on your handout, Europe had been involved in trade with Africa for tropical goods and slaves. And that was like one of the first reasons why white Europeans were like really kind of curious about Africa. They saw it as a source of slave labor. And that's like the first, interactions they had. But by the early 1800s, European powers kind of had like a change of heart about slavery. And they declared the importation of slaves, you'll write down, was illegal. You might remember we actually even watched a video from a movie called Amistad with Morgan Freeman. And there was a group of enslaved Africans that ultimately won a court case in the Supreme Court because even though they were black Africans, they were brought in illegally. The United States had slavery legal, but it was illegal to bring in any new slaves. Below that, it says, the abolition of slavery was led by Great Britain. Of all the countries in the world, the British were against slavery. They actually sent out ships around the world, and if your ship had slaves, they would stop your ship, they would take the slaves. Even if you're like, hey, my country, it's legal, they said, we don't care. We think it's wrong for everyone. So the country that led the abolition of slavery was Great Britain. And Europeans, after they stopped moving black people across the Atlantic Ocean, they transitioned from the slave trade to raw materials. So they're still looking to Africa for something. They're still looking to exploit. They're still looking to take, but they're not taking humans, they're taking raw materials. And Europe's going to look to 3 different types of raw materials that they want to take from Africa. The first type of raw material they want to take from Africa, it's like a standard. Humans have wanted this forever. Europe turned to Africa for gold. That's not a shocker. It's not a surprise. You write down gold. There's a second thing that you can make jewelry, piano keys out of, and it's, very rare. It's illegal actually to own anything out of this today because it is going to make something go extinct. What did we make piano keys out of? The white ones. Ivory, yeah. We'll write down ivory is the second thing that Europe turned to Africa for. So we have gold, we have ivory, and a third thing we've never really talked about, but we'll increasingly talk about, palm oil. If you don't know how to spell palm oil, it's actually written just one line below. And that's kind of a weird one. I don't know why we would need that unless we went through an industrial revolution, because like your car, you need to change the oil of your car. All machines need an industrial lubricant, and this oil was considered the perfect industrial lubricant. Palm oil was used, you'll write down, in industrial factories. This is what kept these machines going. This is what kept them from jamming. And you cannot grow these tropical plants in Europe. It's too cold. So they went to the African continent to extract palm oil. There's also a growing demand for diamonds as well. And sadly, many of these diamonds were being extracted by slave labor. Even to this day, sadly, some mines use slave labor for the extraction of diamonds in Africa. 4 minutes, let's go to the next section. For most of the 1800s, trade was limited to along the coast of Africa. And there's a reason why white people stayed on the coast. What happened when white people left the coast of Africa and went inland? Yeah, they got sick, right? Diseases, it says on the second line, kept Europeans from the coast, especially what disease? Malaria. We've talked about this 1,000 times, especially malaria. And there's 2 exceptions to this rule. The French, you might remember, they had a colony in the North African country of Algeria. You'll write that down. The North African country of Algeria. And the Dutch and later British colonies, last thing to write down, they had a colony in South Africa. South Africa. And we'll go ahead and stop right there. There's no homework today. There was homework due today, though. If you didn't get it finished up, make sure you submit the pictures and you turn that in. I hope you all have a great, wonderful day at LaPorte High School. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.